Greetings and welcome back. Roskin discusses the weakness of the Catholic Church in the 16th century, which really fueled the notion that I introduced in the last mini lecture that kings could rule by divine right. In other words, they got their political power directly from God. It wasn't bestowed by the Pope or by the Church, which really weakened, obviously, the power of the church in some of these places. The idea that sovereignty was vested in only one person, the monarch, became known as absolutism. And when we get to France, absolutism is deeply rooted until the French Revolution in 1789. And in fact, not only France, but many European states, not England, of course. So just a review going back a few lectures ago, remember that the notion of constitutionalism goes back formally to 1215, back to the Magna Carta, and informally even before that. So the political tradition in Britain had always been power sharing. The only debate was exactly what the distribution of power was between the executive, the monarch, and the legislative branch, which were the landed aristocrats. As I mentioned in the last mini lecture, by the time of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, the assumption was that the monarch and the parliament were co-equal, that they were intertwined, that they were in essence married. But with the death of Elizabeth I in 1603, there was a significant power vacuum in England and a new royal family, because remember, the Tudors had been the royal family from 1485 with Henry VII and with Henry VIII, and of course with Elizabeth I. And with her death, we get a new royal family, the Stuarts, who are going to challenge this 4 centuries old basic assumption of constitutionalism, which had dominated and been the kind of the political milieu, the environment in which the British government existed. So James and Charles Stuart, these new kings, claimed divine right. They claimed that they did not need to consult Parliament on taxes, and that Parliament really did not have the right to question their power and authority. The big showdown, as Roskin points out, is that both James and Charles Stuart both tried to levy taxes without the consent of the Parliament, which resulted in the beheading of Charles for treason after a civil war that ravaged Britain for about 6 years, from 1642 to 1648. Now, this civil war was a rarity in Britain. It left England without executive authority, and that hadn't existed at all, even during the War of the Roses, while the royal figure changes throughout that era. There was always an executive authority, and now, at the end of the Civil War, the only political force that was organized in Britain was the army under the command of Oliver Cromwell, who imposed a military dictatorship until his death in 1658. And of course, the military continued to govern for a couple of years until 1660. And in 1660, interestingly enough, the Parliament invites Charles's son, the son of the beheaded king, to return from Dutch exile and become king. Now, obviously, Charles II, knowing what had happened to his father, understood that he could not claim divine right, that he couldn't impose taxes unilaterally. He understood that he would be limited in some ways. But Charles II, while understanding he would have to massage the Parliament a bit, believed that he could manipulate the Parliament. He believed that he could slowly and very discreetly return the monarch's allegiance to Rome and to the Catholic Church. So Ruskin does a good job, I think, although he leaves a few things out, and I'll mention a couple. But in this particular case, he decides to float an idea that by modern standards would appear to be an act of religious tolerance. What Ruskin calls the Declaration of Indulgence, which would lift laws that discriminated against Catholics and that discriminated against non-Anglican Protestants. Now, what Ruskin doesn't mention is that the worst war in the history of the world until World War I had recently concluded. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. It had ravaged the continent. The population of Europe declined by about a third during this era, and it was a war that was fought between Catholic and Protestant princes. Thomas Hobbes, for example, who I talk about in American Government and most people do, one of the reasons he advocated a separation of church and state was because when he looked at his world in the 17th century, in the 1600s, you mix religion and politics, and people die. So even though by today's standards, this would seem to be a law that would be fine. You're not going to discriminate against Catholics. You're not going to discriminate against non-Anglican Protestants. It sounds good, but in the context of the time, the Parliament is going to perceive this as an illegal return to Catholicism that might threaten, because remember, the vast majority, in fact, all of the people in Parliament at the time, were Protestants, and so they blocked the move. And this triggered an anti-Catholic hysteria throughout Britain. And this continued long after this episode. For example, it was not until 1829 that Catholics were permitted to be members of Parliament. For Jews, it was 1858, and it wasn't until 1888 that self-avowed atheists could be members of Parliament. Your book also, and I'll mention it later, probably in the next mini lecture, but in 1701, we get a law passed called the Act of Settlement. And the Act of Settlement set the terms for succession to the royal throne, who could and could not be a royal in Britain. And one of the terms of exclusion was that Roman Catholics were to be excluded from the monarchy, which meant that the Catholic Stuart children, right, could not become king or queen of England. Now, ironically, it did not say anything about Stuart children who were Protestant could become the monarchs of Britain. And of course, that is exactly, in this case, what happened. So this anti-Catholic notion and this battle between Catholics and Protestants, if you look at the world of the mid to late 1600s in Europe, keep in mind that an unbelievably horrific war had occurred. And even in Britain, the Civil War in the 1640s that went from 1642 to 48 was a war fought largely between Catholic royalists, people who supported the king, and Protestant parliamentarians who opposed the king. So Charles dies in 1685, and his much more openly Catholic brother James II attempts to float a second act of indulgence. Now, James's act was looked at with a lot more fear. One, because it had been tried before, but two, because he was much more openly Catholic, and there was a fear that this really was not only a return to Catholicism, but perhaps a reclamation on that concept of an absolutist monarchy. So the Parliament dumped him. They deposed him, but they let him escape, and I believe he ended up going to France, if I remember correctly. And when he fled the country, the Parliament invited his Protestant daughter, Mary, and her Dutch husband, William, who was the head of state in the Netherlands, and your book doesn't point this out, I'm just adding a few things for you, to be the new king and queen. Mary didn't govern very long. I'm going to cheat and take a quick look because I forgot the exact year she died. She died real young. She died of smallpox at age 32. She ruled from 1689 to 1694. When she died, William of Orange, as he's known, from the Netherlands, became the head of state until his death in 1702. But before his death, there was that act of succession that occurred. And there you go. So, an intriguing era, and of course the significance of this Parliament versus the King and Civil War is that we get this glorious revolution that results in the supremacy of Parliament. Up until the Glorious Revolution, of course, we talked about how there had been this battle between which is supreme, the executive under the monarch or the legislature under the Parliament. We talked about how the Parliament became more powerful. Eventually, the Parliament became an equal. And now with the Glorious Revolution, it is going to be the Parliament. Now, shortly after, and I'm going to get into this in the next mini lecture, with the Glorious Revolution, there are several concepts that we steal from the British and we see in the American Constitution. So once again, even though the British model of government, the parliamentary system, is seen as the opposite of the American political system, I've already given you a couple of ways in which historical traditions of Britain were modified a bit but put into the American Constitution. I'm going to give you some more. But on the next page, I'm going to introduce you to another executive. You see, up until the Glorious Revolution, the executive had been the monarch and the legislature had been the Parliament. But early in the 18th century, in the early 1700s, only a couple of decades after the Glorious Revolution, we're going to get the introduction of a new executive figure called the Prime Minister. Once again, just like the Parliament was originally an extension of the king, right, a forum to raise revenue, originally the Prime Minister was seen as the monarch's guy, if you will, his chief advisor, the person to look after his affairs, for example, when he was out of the country, was kind of the concept. But of course, just as the Parliament became more independent, the Prime Minister is going to become more independent. Of course, today in Britain, the Prime Minister is the chief executive. The monarch is still the head of state, the chief of state, the ceremonial leader, but it is the Prime Minister that is the true chief executive. And we will talk about the significance of the Glorious Revolution and the rise of the Prime Minister in the next series of mini lectures. Have a wonderful day.